A woman stands in the middle of the main street of a dying town, 3 coins in her hand, her feverish daughter dying at home, and the whole town staring at her as if she deserved it. They used to know her name. They used to smile at her. Now they turn away, just because of a missing coin, just because she's the wife of a loser. But just as she's about to give up, a stranger approaches, not to save her, but to offer a deal that will change everything. Follow this story to the end and leave the name of your city in the comments so I know how far my story has come. The milk was 52 cents. Marin Hale had 39. She stood at the counter of Alderton's general store with 3 coins pressed so hard into her palm that their edges left marks in her skin, and she counted them again because counting felt like doing something, even when nothing could be done. A nickel, a dime, and a penny she'd found wedged under the floorboard near the stove that morning. 24 cents. She'd borrowed a dime from the coffee tin she kept hidden at the back of the shelf, the one she still thought of as Jonah's, though Jonah had been in the ground for 4 months. 34 cents, then a nickel from the lining of her winter coat sewn in there when they'd first married because Jonah said, "You never know." 39. 13 short. Behind her, 2 women from the Methodist charitable circle were discussing whether to order new hymnals. Their voices were polite and even, the way voices always were in public. They didn't look at Marin. People in Black Ridge had gotten good at not looking at her. 52 cents for the condensed, said Hector Alderton. Not unkindly, but not kindly either. He was a thin man with ink stains on his fingers and a ledger he kept meticulous. You know how it is, Mrs. Hale. I can't extend more store credit until the account's cleared. I understand, Marin said. I do. But Della's sick. Mr. Alderton. She's been sick 3 days and I can't get her to keep anything down, and the doctor said she needs milk if she won't take the broth. I'm sorry about the little girl. He sounded like he meant it, which almost made it worse. Just until Friday, Marin said. I can clear 30 cents of it Friday, I promise you. I'm taking in mending work from Mrs. Hale. His voice dipped, got quieter. I've got suppliers I answer to. I can't be making exceptions. She stood there another moment. The hymnal's conversation continued behind her. Outside, through the smeared front window, she could see the street of Black Ridge doing what it did on a Wednesday afternoon. Wagons, horseback, a dog lying in the shade of the post office steps. The kind of normal she'd stopped feeling part of. 13 cents, she said. Not asking anymore, just saying it out loud as if the specific smallness of the number might make it real to him. That's all I'm short. Hector Alderton looked at his ledger, then at the shelf, then at a spot somewhere above her left shoulder. I'm sorry, he said again, and he was sorry. She believed that, but sorry didn't buy condensed milk. She picked up her coins from the counter, pushed them back into her coat pocket, and walked out. The air outside was dry and carried the smell of dust and horse and the faint sweetness of hay from the livery at the end of the block. October had come into the high country the way it always did, fast and without warning, pulling the heat out of the days in one long exhale. The mountains to the north were already showing snow on their upper ridges, white edges against a sky so blue it looked painted. Marin stood on the boardwalk and let herself have exactly one moment where she didn't think about Della's fever or the empty pantry or the $40 debt she couldn't see the bottom of. One moment where she just stood in the cold air and breathed. Then she put on her face and walked. She'd already tried the other places. Crandall's Feed and Dry Goods didn't carry canned milk. The widow Pressler, who'd been something like a friend in the early years, had answered the door with her arms crossed and said she didn't have anything to spare, which wasn't true. Marin had seen the full woodpile through the side window, the jars of preserves lined up on the kitchen shelf behind her, but she didn't push. You stop pushing after a while. It costs too much. The Hale name had been a respected name in Black Ridge once. Not wealthy, not important, but solid. Jonah's family had homesteaded 15 miles south of town, and Jonah himself had grown up known to people, which meant Marin had been known to people by extension. When she'd married him at 19 and moved into the house near Cutter Creek, she'd thought she was stepping into something lasting. But Jonah was the kind of man who couldn't stop believing the next thing would fix everything. The cattle venture, the mining claim, the partnership with a man named Fuller who'd taken his money and left the territory. Each failure sat heavier than the last. The town watched, the way small towns do, with a patience that slowly curdled into judgment. And when Jonah finally got sick, fever, then lung, then gone in 10 days that still didn't feel real, what he left behind wasn't grief so much as an accounting, a ledger of everything that hadn't worked, and a wife and daughter who were now, in the eyes of Black Ridge, proof of it. She'd been proof of Jonah's failure for 4 months now. She was tired of it. At the corner of Main and Settler, she stopped. A man she recognized, Bud Casto, who'd sold Jonah the bad mining stake, was crossing the street. He looked up, saw her, looked away, and crossed faster. She watched him go and felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, something flatter and colder than either. She turned north and walked toward the edge of town, toward the small house she was renting for $6 a month from a man named Garfield who'd already been by twice to ask about the October payment. She was still a block away when she heard Della coughing. Della was 5 years old and built like Jonah, slight with his pale coloring and his wide-spaced eyes, but she had a stubbornness that was entirely her own. 3 days into the fever, and she was still fighting it with everything she had, which right now was mostly her lungs. Marin pushed through the door, dropped her coat on the hook, and crossed to the back room where she'd made a bed out of the good quilt and 2 pillows. Della was awake. That was something. Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes had that glassy look that made Marin's chest tighten, but she was awake. "Mama!" Her voice came out rough. "I'm here!" Marin sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the back of her hand to Della's forehead, still too warm. "How's your stomach?" "Empty," Della said, with a frankness that was so purely her that Marin almost smiled. "I know, sweetheart. I'm going to find you something." "Did you get the milk?" "I'm working on it." Della accepted this with the solemn seriousness of someone who'd been hearing "we're working on it" for most of her life. She closed her eyes, and Marin sat there listening to her breathe until it steadied into something less labored. Then she went to the kitchen and opened every cupboard. Half a bag of cornmeal, some dried beans that would take 3 hours to cook, 2 potatoes that were starting to go soft, a heel of bread that had gone hard enough to use as a doorstop. She stood at the counter for a long time. When she went back out, she took the coffee tin with her. The woman at the church hall, Sister Oakes, who ran what passed for charity services in Black Ridge, received Marin in a back room that smelled of candle wax and old paper. Sister Oakes was not a bad woman. She was an organized woman, which sometimes amounted to the same thing. "We do have a distribution day," Sister Oakes said, consulting her book. "First Thursday of the month." "That's 8 days," Marin said. "My daughter is sick now." "Yes, and I understand that, but if I start making exceptions—" "Is there anyone in this town," Marin said carefully, keeping her voice even, "who will help me get 1 can of condensed milk for a sick child? That's all I'm asking. 1 can. Sister Oakes looked pained. "Mrs. Hale, the difficulty is, and I say this without judgment, your family account is one of the open ones. When Mr. Hale passed, there were outstanding—" "I know what there were," Marin said, "and it puts the organization in a difficult position in terms of resources." "I understand," Marin said. She stood up. "I'm sorry to have taken your time." She went back out into the street. The humiliation wasn't a single moment. It was a drip, a constant wearing down of something she was trying to keep whole. It was the way Hector Alderton's eyes had moved to that spot above her shoulder, the way the women in the store hadn't looked up from their hymnals, the way Bud Casto had walked faster, the way Sister Oak's voice had softened with pity that didn't translate into anything useful. The worst of it was that she understood all of them. They weren't monsters. They were just people who had decided that she was on the wrong side of a line they needed to believe in. The line between people who managed and people who didn't. If she was on the wrong side of it, they were safe on the right side. That was how it worked. It didn't make standing in the middle of Main Street any easier. She was counting her coins again, not because she'd miscounted, but because her hands needed something to do, when she heard the voice. "You're Mrs. Hale." It wasn't a question. She turned. The man standing behind her was tall, broad across the chest, with a face weathered past the point of estimating age, somewhere between 35 and 50, most likely somewhere in the middle. He wore a canvas work coat and boots that had seen serious use. His hat was plain and functional, He held it in his hands rather than on his head, which gave her the odd impression he'd taken it off out of habit rather than courtesy, the way a man does when he enters somewhere and forgets he's not indoors. I am, Marin said. Name's Mercer, Colt Mercer. He didn't offer a hand. I've got a place about 30 miles north, up past Harlan Pass. High country. I know where Harlan Pass is, she said, though she didn't know him. He nodded as if this was the expected response. Heard you were looking for work. Mending. She looked at him more carefully now. He didn't have the look of a man who needed mending done. He was big-handed and self-sufficient looking, the kind of person who wore something until it fell apart and then replaced it rather than repaired it. Where'd you hear that? Around? He shrugged, which was more or less the whole answer. I've got a ranch that needs more than mending. Cook's position's been empty 3 months. I had a woman working for me. She left to go back to her sister in Colorado. Place has gone to hell, frankly. Marin waited. Room and board, he said. Meals for your daughter. Cash at the end of each month, $12. It's not soft work. She stared at him. You don't know me. Somebody told me you were organized and not afraid of hard work. That's all I need to know. Who told you that? He thought about it. Old Kessler, at the feed store. He said you used to help your husband keep the books, and that you were the one actually running things even when he wasn't. She didn't know whether to feel grateful to Kessler or embarrassed by the truth of it. The ranch, she said. You're up there alone? Just me and the hired hand, Rue. He's about 60 and doesn't talk much. Why are you asking me? You could hire from the valley. I could, he said. He didn't add anything to this. She looked down at the coins in her hand, 39 cents, and a world that had been telling her for 4 months that she and her daughter were a burden it couldn't carry. She thought about Della's face in the glassy half-light of that back room. She thought about 8 days until Thursday's distribution. My daughter is sick, she said. I need condensed milk today. He reached into his coat pocket and put $1 on the post box between them without any ceremony. Get what she needs. We'd leave tomorrow morning. You don't know me, she said again, but her voice had changed. It wasn't an objection. It was more like a warning, like she was giving him the chance to reconsider. He looked at her steadily. He had gray eyes, the color of creek water in November. They were not unkind. No, he said, but you look like someone who does what she says she'll do. Marin looked at the $1, then at the mountains to the north, white-edged and enormous, then at the street behind her, the same street that had, over the past 4 months, quietly and efficiently communicated that she was not wanted in it. She picked up the $1. 7 o'clock, she said. I'll need to pack. He nodded, put his hat back on, and walked away. She bought 2 cans of milk and carried them home at something close to a run. Della drank the milk warm, cut with a little water and a pinch of the last of the sugar, and she kept it down. All of it. By the time evening came in through the window and the air outside dropped the last of its warmth, the child's color had changed. Not all the way, not fixed, but moving in the right direction. Marin sat beside her and felt the change in her forehead and let herself have the relief of it, just for a minute, before the rest of the night's business took over. She packed in the dark. There wasn't much. Della's clothes first, the practical ones, 2 dresses that were clean, the wool stockings, the good boots that were already a little small but would last another season if she was careful. Her own things next, work dresses, 2 good aprons, the winter coat, her sewing box, the coffee tin, empty now, the small stack of papers she kept in the flour sack, Della's birth record, the land papers that had gone to the county after the debt was cleared, the 3 letters she'd kept from her own mother. At the bottom of the trunk she found Jonah's watch, which she'd forgotten was there. She held it for a while. It was a plain silver thing, kept decent time, nothing special. She thought about what to do with it for a long time and then put it back in the trunk under everything else. She didn't sleep. By 5 in the morning she had the trunk at the door, the house cleared of the things that were hers, and the stove cold. She'd left a note for Garfield with the key, explaining that she'd vacated the property and apologizing for the October rent. She owed him that much, the truth, and the key. At 6 she woke Della. The child looked at the packed trunk and the empty shelves and said, "Are we leaving?" "Yes," Marin said. "Where are we going?" "Into the mountains. There's a ranch." Della absorbed this. Will there be animals? Most likely. What kind? I don't know yet. Horses, probably. Della considered this seriously and then nodded, as if horses were an acceptable reason to leave everything she knew. Marin helped her dress and braided her hair and gave her the last of the bread, softened in the warm water from the stove, and watched her eat it with the focus of someone who'd been hungry enough to take eating seriously. At 7:15, Colt Mercer came up the street with a wagon. He looked at the trunk and then at Della, who was standing on the front step examining him with complete frankness. "You're the man from yesterday," she said. "That's right," he said. "You gave my mama $1. "I did." She thought about this. "Are you rich?" "No," he said. She seemed to find this satisfactory. "Okay," she said, and went to look at the horses. Colt lifted the trunk into the wagon bed without asking for help or waiting for direction. He did it the way he'd put the $1 on the post box, without ceremony, as if it was simply the next thing to do. Marin watched him and thought, I don't know this man. I don't know where he came from or why he's doing this or what he expects. She thought, I know what this town expects of me, and it's nothing good. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. He came around to his side and picked up the reins. Della had settled herself between them without being invited, small and upright with her hands in her lap. "Ready?" he said. Marin looked down the length of Main Street one last time. The morning was clear and cold. Nobody was watching. Nobody had come to see her go, and she hadn't expected them to. The street was just a street. "Yes," she said. He clicked to the horses, and the wagon moved. They went north. The road out of Black Ridge climbed from the first mile, winding up through scrub oak and cedar that gave way to ponderosa as the elevation rose. The horses, two big grays, solid-looking and patient, took the grade without complaint. The wagon creaked and swayed on the ruts. Della fell asleep against Marin's side before they'd been going an hour, her fever-warm weight familiar and reassuring. Colt drove without talking much, which Marin appreciated. She wasn't in the mood for the kind of conversation that required her to explain herself. She watched the country change as they climbed, the valley falling away below them, Black Ridge becoming a cluster of gray shapes, and then just a suggestion of structures among trees, and then gone. After a while, he said, without looking at her, "She seems stronger this morning." The milk helped. "Good." Silence again. The horses worked steadily. "The cook's duties," Marin said. "What exactly are we talking about?" "Cooking, mainly. 3 meals a day when I'm at the ranch. I'm out on the range sometimes for 2-3 days, keeping the house. There's a root cellar and a smokehouse. Both need restocking before the snow comes in. Chickens. The kitchen garden, it's been neglected." "How neglected?" He exhaled slowly. "More than I'd like to admit." "And the salary is $12 a month. Cash. End of the month. I'll want to be paid in full the first month before we discuss the second." He glanced at her. She met his eyes without apology. "Fair enough," he said. "And my daughter's schooling. I've been teaching her myself, but I'll need time in the evenings for that. It's not negotiable." He seemed to consider this. "Understood. And I need to know what the expectations are. All of them. If there are expectations beyond what you've said, I'd rather know them now." He looked at the road. Something moved in his jaw. "The expectations are what I told you," he said. "Work, room, board, nothing else." She believed him mostly, not because she was naive. She'd learned to be a lot of things she hadn't wanted to learn, but because of how he'd said it, like someone stating a fact they were mildly irritated to have to state. "All right," she said. "All right," he echoed. They drove. The pass came in the early afternoon, a long switchback climb through a narrow cut in the rock that opened suddenly into a broad bowl of high country, a valley maybe 3 miles across, ringed by peaks that still held their summer color except where the first snow had clung to the shadowed faces. A creek ran through the middle of it, bright even from this distance, and along its far bank she could see the dark shapes of buildings. A main house, a barn, several outbuildings, and the brown-gold geometry of fenced pastures. Della, who had woken when the wagon slowed for the climb, was now standing up with her hands on the wagon's front board, trying to see better. "Sit down," Marin said. "Is that it?" "Sit down, please." Della sat but kept her face forward. It's big, she said. It was. Marin hadn't expected it to be quite this big. The house was 2 stories, properly built, with a covered porch along the front and what looked like a stone foundation. The barn was older but solid. The land, she could see, even from here, had gone somewhat wild, the kitchen garden visible as a tangled patch to the south side of the house, the fence line sagging in places. "How long have you had it?" Marin asked. 7 years, Colt said. Came up from New Mexico. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. The descent into the valley was gentler than the climb, and by the time they crossed the creek on a plank bridge that shook but held and pulled up in front of the main house, the late afternoon light had gone gold and long across the grass. A man was sitting on the porch steps, old, lean as a fence post, with a hat that had collapsed entirely on one side. He didn't stand when they pulled up. "Rue," Colt said. "Mercer," the old man said. He looked at Marin, then at Della. He said, and that appeared to be his entire response to the situation. Colt climbed down. "Rue'll show you the house," he told Marin. "I need to check on the south pasture fence before dark. Supper." He stopped. "I'll handle supper," Marin said. He nodded once and walked toward the barn. Marin climbed down and lifted Della down after her. The child stood on the ground of the yard and turned in a slow circle, looking at everything. The mountains, the barn, the creek, the tired-looking garden. "Mama," she said, "I like it here." "You haven't been here an hour," Marin said. "I still like it." The old man, Rue, got up from the steps with the deliberate care of someone whose knees had opinions. He held the door open without speaking. Marin picked up her bag and went inside. The kitchen was large and cold and considerably disordered. Dirty dishes in the basin, a grease-filmed stove, a table that had been used as a workspace as much as anything else, papers, harness leather, a broken axe handle. But the bones of it were good. She could see that. Solid construction, proper chimney, a floor that had been swept recently enough to know someone cared. She set her bag down. She rolled up her sleeves. She found wood stacked by the back door and got the stove going. Found flour, lard, dried beans, a slab of salt pork. Not much, but enough. She cleared the table, washed the dishes that were there, put Della at the end of the table with the slate board and a piece of chalk, and told her to practice her letters and numbers until supper. By the time the light outside had gone fully dark, and Colt Mercer came in from the barn with mud on his boots and his coat smelling of cold air and horse, there was cornbread cooling on the rack, a pot of beans with salt pork and onion on the stove, and a kettle of coffee that had been keeping warm for 20 minutes. He stopped in the doorway and looked at it all. "Sit down," Marin said, without looking up from the bread she was cutting. "Supper's ready." He sat. Rue materialized from somewhere and sat across from him. Della was already in her seat, hands folded, watching everyone with her wide-spaced eyes. Marin brought the pot to the table, served out the beans, set the bread down where everyone could reach it, and poured the coffee. Then she sat. Nobody said anything for a minute. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Rue picked up his spoon and ate, and that appeared to be all the grace they were getting. Colt ate. He didn't compliment the food, which she found she preferred to the alternative. It felt honest. He ate the way he did everything else, without ceremony, because it was the next thing to be done. Della ate all of her beans and 2 pieces of cornbread and drank her warm water, and then looked at Colt with the thoughtful expression of someone who'd been formulating a question. "Do you have any dogs?" she asked. "One," he said. "Where is it?" "Barn, most likely. Can I see it tomorrow?" "If you're up early enough." Della nodded, satisfied. She looked at her mother. "I like it here," she said again. Marin looked at her daughter, the color returning slowly to her cheeks, the animation in her eyes that had been missing for 3 days, and felt something that was not quite peace and not quite relief, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both. Outside, the wind had come down off the mountains. She could hear it moving through the eaves of the house, testing the seams, the way wind does at elevation when the season is turning. But inside the kitchen, the stove was going and the food was on the table and the child was eating. She had 39 cents in her coat pocket and no idea what came next. But she had gotten this far. The dog's name was Bucket, which was a terrible name for a dog, and Della loved him immediately. He was a medium-sized animal of uncertain ancestry. Some shepherd in him, maybe some hound, and something else entirely that expressed itself in the odd tufted ears and the way he moved sideways when he was happy instead of straight forward. He was old enough to have gray on his muzzle, and young enough in spirit to still act like he'd invented the concept of mourning. He'd been waiting at the barn door when Della came out in the thin early light, still in her sleeping clothes with her coat thrown over them, and he'd pressed his whole weight against her legs like he'd been waiting for her specifically. Marin watched from the kitchen window and let herself have a moment of something that felt almost ordinary. Then she went back to the stove. The first week was about learning the geography of the place. Not the valley or the mountains, but the ranch itself. Every property had its logic, its habits, the particular way things had been done long enough that changing them required a fight with invisible precedent. Mercer's ranch was no different. The smokehouse was built east of the barn, which meant the prevailing wind brought the smoke toward the house rather than away from it. And someone had been living with this problem for 7 years, because it had always been this way. The root cellar had a drainage issue on the north wall that had been partially solved by wedging a piece of board against the stone and partially left to be someone else's problem. The chicken coop was structurally sound but positioned such that it got no afternoon sun in winter, which was why the hens were laying less than they should have been. Marin cataloged all of it, not because she'd been asked to, but because this was how her mind worked, like keeping books, like tracking where things were and where they ought to be. Jonah had called it fussing, the first year of their marriage, before he'd understood how much of what worked in their household worked because of that fussing. She'd stopped telling him about it after a while and just done it quietly. Here there was no one to tell or not tell. She just did the work. Colt was out before dawn most mornings and back sometime after dark, and in between she had the house, the garden, and her own learning curve. The kitchen garden was the worst of it. She'd expected neglect, but not quite this degree of it. The frost had already hit twice, and whatever had been planted in spring had either been harvested piecemeal or left to go woody and seedy in the ground. She pulled what was salvageable, a few winter squash that had been overlooked, some root vegetables that had survived under the soil, and began turning the beds, working in the manure from the barn pile, preparing for the next season, even though next season was still months away. Rue watched her the first morning she was out there with the fork. "You're turning the beds wrong," he said. She kept working. "How do you mean?" "That row runs east-west. You want north-south for the sun exposure." She stopped and looked. He was right. She looked at the whole layout of the garden and saw what she hadn't seen before. Someone had laid it out in a hurry without thinking about the angle of the winter sun. "Who planted this originally?" "Mercer. First year." "Did anyone tell him about the orientation?" Rue was quiet for a moment. "I'm telling you about it now." She didn't point out that this was not an answer to her question. She pulled up the stakes at the end of the row and reset them. Rue watched for another minute, nodded once, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. That was more or less how it went with Rue. He'd spent 30 years ranching in various capacities for various people, and he held his knowledge the way old men sometimes did. Not generously, but not greedily either. He'd offer a correction when he had one, then leave you to it. She found she could work with this. Della, recovering steadily, had taken to following Rue around the property when Marin was occupied in the house. This appeared to bother him considerably less than he let on. By the third day, she'd gotten him to teach her how to scatter feed for the chickens. By the fifth, she'd somehow secured permission to name the 2 barn cats, which she did with great deliberation. The gray one became Albert, and the black one became Agnes, names she'd apparently selected from the spines of books she'd been staring at in the small shelf near the kitchen door. "That's a man's name and a woman's name," Rue observed. "I know," Della said. "I thought it was fair." Rue had no follow-up. Marin caught the edge of this exchange from across the yard and felt the particular kind of relief that came from watching your child be herself again. The real self, not the pale, quiet version who'd lain in the back bedroom of the Black Ridge house getting smaller. The mountain air was doing something, or the milk was, or just the space of the place, the fact of all that open country with no one in it who knew the Hale name and what it was supposed to mean. She'd been at the ranch 11 days when Colt came in from the range late on a Thursday, later than usual, and sat down at the table without taking his coat off. Marin set a plate in front of him, venison stew, the last of the potatoes, and poured the coffee. South fence is down in 3 places, he said. Took most of the afternoon. Did you eat out there? Biscuit this morning. She went back to the stove where there was still half the pot. She filled a second bowl and set it beside the first without comment. He looked at it. Thank you. It's just stew. I know what it is. He said it without edge, just leveling. He picked up the spoon and ate for a while. The fire in the stove had gotten low, and she fed it another piece of wood and stood watching it catch. The chickens are laying better, she said. I noticed. The coop needed more afternoon light. I shifted one of the side panels. Rue showed me where the tools were. He chewed. You didn't need to do that. It wasn't what I hired you for. You hired me to keep the house, she said. The chickens are part of the house. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. All right. She sat down across from him with her coffee. The house was quiet. Della had been asleep since 8. Rue had his own small cabin 20 yards to the south, and the only sound was the wind working at the window frames and the occasional shift of the fire. It was the kind of quiet that took some getting used to after living in town, where there was always some kind of noise, always someone's business bleeding into your own. You grew up in a town? He asked. He said it like he'd been thinking about something else, and this had come out alongside it. Small one. East of here, in the valley. My father kept a dry goods store. She wrapped her hands around the mug. You? Ranch family, he said. New Mexico. Different kind of country. Why did you come up here? He looked at the table. Needed a change. She recognized the tone. It was the tone of someone who'd answered the question and was done answering it. She didn't push. She understood the value of that particular kind of privacy. The fence posts for the root cellar drainage, she said, shifting cleanly to something else. Do you have additional lumber? That board I found isn't going to hold past spring melt. He looked up slightly, recalibrating. There's lumber in the barn loft. Take what you need. I'd like to fix the north wall properly before the ground freezes. Once it freezes, I can't get to the drain channel. He nodded slowly. I can help with that Saturday, if you mark where the problem is. I can show you tomorrow. It'll take less time with 2 people. All right, he said, and that was how it went. Not a conversation so much as a series of logistics, the language of 2 people who were getting through the business of a day together and finding, without particularly trying to, that they were reasonably suited to it. He finished the stew and carried his bowl to the basin, which she hadn't expected. In her experience, men who hired cooks did not carry their own dishes to the basin. He washed it himself, briefly, with the efficiency of someone who knew how but didn't consider it remarkable either way, and set it on the rack. Good stew, he said on his way out. Good venison, she replied. He went out the back door toward the barn to check on the horses, which he did every night regardless of how late it was, and Maren sat with her coffee and looked at the table and thought, this is manageable. This is a thing I can do. It wasn't happiness. She wasn't ready for that word yet and wasn't sure she trusted it, but it was something. A floor under her feet, which was more than she'd had in Black Ridge. October became November, and the valley pulled inward around them the way mountain valleys do when winter begins to make its intentions clear. The higher passes snowed in first, isolating them from the road down to the lower country, which was more or less expected. Rue had made 2 supply runs before the pass became unreliable, and the root cellar was better stocked than it had been in years. If Colt's expression of moderate surprise when he inventoried it was any indication, Della's lessons continued in the evenings. Maren had found 3 books in the house, a surveying manual, a collected history of the Western Territories, and a volume of poetry so worn that several pages had come loose from the binding, and she supplemented them with the lessons she'd been teaching before Black Ridge, the arithmetic and reading and the geography she tried to make interesting by tying it to the mountains they could see from the window. Della was good at numbers and indifferent to poetry and intensely curious about maps, which seemed right. Sometimes Colt was in the room while the lessons went on. He'd sit with his own work, harness mending, accounts he kept in a plain ledger, and not participate, but Maren noticed he listened. Once when Della had gotten stuck on a subtraction problem and Maren was waiting to see if she'd work it through, Colt said, without looking up from the harness, "Start with the bigger number and count back." Just that. Della tried it and got the answer and looked at him with the expression of someone encountering new technology. "Did you know that?" she asked him. "Somebody told me once," he said. "Who?" He thought about it for a moment, the way he sometimes did when a question required more than he was used to giving. "My mother," he said. "Long time ago." Della nodded seriously, as if this were a satisfying origin story for a piece of arithmetic. The month passed in the specific texture of hard work and cold mornings, and the incremental satisfaction of things improving. Marin remortared 2 sections of the chimney that had been crumbling, a job that left her hands raw for a week. She reorganized the smokehouse and helped Rue hang the last of the venison, learned from him how he prepared the brine, argued mildly with him about salt quantities, and arrived at a compromise that was mostly his way but slightly adjusted. She made curtains for the kitchen and the room where she and Della slept, because the windows were single pane and in November the cold came through them like a draft. She used flour sacking and the remnant wool she found in a box in the storage room, and they were not pretty curtains, but they held the warmth. On the last day of October, Colt knocked on the doorframe of the kitchen in the early evening and set an envelope on the table. "End of the first month," he said. $12 in it. She counted it because she'd said she would, right there at the table while he watched, and he didn't seem bothered by this. "Same agreement for November?" he said. She put the money in her apron pocket. "Yes," she said. "Good." He turned to go. She said, without quite planning to, "The place is better than it was." He stopped. "I know it. I just meant—" She stopped, not sure what she meant exactly, that it mattered to her that he noticed, that she wasn't just doing this for the money, though the money was necessary, that something about this place, this valley, this cold and particular piece of the high country, was starting to feel like it was worth the effort for its own sake. "You've done good work," he said, "more than what was asked." He seemed like he might say more, and then didn't, and went out. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand in her apron pocket around the $12. Then she went to check on the stove and start dinner because the evening was cold, and Rue would be in from the barn soon, and Della would wake from her nap hungry, and there was still work to do. The letter came in early December, brought up by a man named Caswell, who ran supplies occasionally to the valley ranches. He left it with Rue while Colt was on the range, and Rue set it on the table without comment, and Marin saw it when she came in from the garden and stopped. It was addressed to her. The return address was a law office in a town called Faro, 60 miles southeast. She didn't recognize the name of the office, but she recognized the name written below it. Silas Hale. Jonah's older brother. She had met him 4 times in her marriage, twice at family occasions, once at the funeral, and once when he'd come to the house in Black Ridge 2 weeks after Jonah died to ask, with the careful politeness of someone who expects to be obeyed, whether she'd thought about where she'd be taking the child. She'd told him she'd be taking the child nowhere and that this was her home. He'd said he'd be in touch. She hadn't heard from him since. She'd thought, in the way that you let yourself think things when you can't afford to be afraid of them, that perhaps he'd let it go. She stood at the table for a long moment before she opened it. The language was legal and formal, and took 3 paragraphs to say what could have been said in one. Silas Hale, as the surviving adult male relative and next of kin of the deceased Jonah Hale, was petitioning the county court for guardianship of Della Hale, minor child, on the grounds that her mother, Marin Hale, had demonstrated a pattern of instability and financial recklessness that called into question her fitness as a sole guardian. The petition cited the debts in Black Ridge, the removal from a settled residence, and with a specificity that made Marin's jaw tighten, her current situation, residing at the property of an unmarried man, working as a household servant, in an arrangement of unclear moral and domestic character. The court date was set for February. She read it twice and set it down on the table and stood very still for a moment. Della was playing in the yard with Bucket. She could hear the child laughing at something the dog had done, the high, clear sound of it carrying through the cold air and through the window glass. Marin folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and set it in the pocket of her apron beside the $12. When Colt came in that evening, she was at the stove. She waited until Della had eaten and gone to bed and Rue had gone to his cabin, and then she took the envelope out and put it on the table. "I need to tell you something," she said. He was pouring his coffee and he stopped and looked at her. Something in her tone must have indicated the conversation required his full attention because he put the pot down and sat. She told him all of it. Silas Hale, the petition, the grounds, the February date. She didn't dress it up or minimize it. He needed the facts to understand the situation, and she had always done better with facts than with explanations of feelings she wasn't certain of. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands. "You mentioned anything about wanting custody for the girl's sake?" he asked. "Not in the letter. The letter is about my fitness, not his affection for Della. He's met her 3 times. What's he after?" She'd thought about this. Jonah had a small land claim that wasn't part of the debts. It's in Della's name. I had that done at the county office before the debt was settled, because a lawyer told me minors' property can't be seized for a parent's debt. It's not much, but it's something. She paused. Silas knew about it. He mentioned it at the funeral. Colt looked at the table. "So this is about the land?" "Most likely." He was quiet again. The fire in the stove settled and shifted. Outside, the wind had come up off the north ridge, the way it did most evenings now, a heavy, pressing sound against the walls of the house. "What does the petition say about this place specifically?" She picked up the envelope, unfolded the letter, and read him the relevant paragraph, the one about residing at the property of an unmarried man. He listened to it without expression. When she finished, he said, "And if the court decides in his favor?" "They take Della." She said it plainly because there was no other way to say it. "He becomes her legal guardian, and I have visitation rights at the court's discretion, which in practice means whatever Silas Hale decides." The silence that followed was long enough that she was starting to think she'd need to say something else, something that moved the conversation along, when he said, "There's something that might change the legal picture." She looked at him. "If you weren't living here as an employee," he said carefully, "the situation would look different to a court." She understood what he was moving toward, but didn't help him get there. She waited. He cleared his throat, which was the most uncertain thing she'd seen him do. "I'm not saying this the right way." "Try again," she said. He looked at her directly. "If we were married, the petition falls apart. You'd have a husband, an established household, a legal family unit. The land claim stays with Della. Silas has no standing." "That's a significant solution to a legal problem," Marin said. "I know it is." "You've thought about this before today." He was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about it some," he admitted. "Not about you specifically. Just, the situation was going to need a resolution at some point." "What situation?" He looked slightly uncomfortable. "You're a woman living on my property. People talk. I've been aware of that." "You didn't mention that when you offered me the job." "No," he said. "I didn't think it would matter this fast." Marin looked at the table. She turned her coffee mug in her hands, the same way he had his. It struck her, briefly and oddly, that this was something they both did when they were thinking. "It would be a practical arrangement," she said, "in the same way the employment arrangement is practical." "Yes." "Nothing changes in terms of the house, the work, how things run." "That's right." "And Della stays," she said. "That's the only thing that actually matters." "I know," he said. She looked at him across the table. This man she'd known for less than 2 months, who she could count on to do what he said he'd do and fix what needed fixing and eat supper without ceremony. She didn't know his history. She didn't know much about his interior life, such as it was. She knew he was fair and he wasn't cruel, and he'd put $1 on a postbox for a woman he'd never met because someone had told him she did what she said she'd do. That wasn't everything, but it wasn't nothing. "Let me think about it," she said. "Take the time you need. I'll have an answer by morning." He nodded and got up and took his coffee mug to the basin and washed it and set it on the rack, the same as every night, as if they'd been discussing fence posts. He put on his coat. "Colt," she said as he reached the back door. He stopped. "If I say yes," she said, "I need it to be clear that this is a decision I'm making, not a circumstance I'm falling into. I need to say yes knowing what I'm agreeing to." He turned and looked at her steadily. "Understood," he said. "All right," she said. "Good night." "Good night," he said, and went out into the dark. She sat at the table for a long time after the door closed. The fire crackled. The wind pressed at the north wall. From the room off the kitchen, she could hear Della breathing in her sleep, slow and even and healthy, the fever long gone, the mountain air having done what the milk and the clean, cold distance from Black Ridge had started. Marin thought about the law office in Faro, about Silas Hale's careful, polite, dangerous interest in a small piece of land and a little girl who barely knew him, about the Black Ridge Street and the 39 cents and the way people had looked past her because it was easier than seeing her. She thought about what she'd built here in 2 months, with her hands and her back and her stubborn, meticulous attention to the logic of things. The root cellar. The garden beds turned the right direction, the chickens laying in proper light, the curtains that weren't pretty but kept the cold out. She thought about Della laughing in the yard with the gray-muzzled dog. By the time she went to bed, she already knew her answer. She'd known it in some practical part of her since the middle of his sentence. She just needed the time to be sure it was her own decision, made clear-eyed and standing on her own feet, and not something the situation was pushing her into because she had no other place to be. There was a difference. It mattered. Morning came the way mornings did at elevation in December, sudden and silver and cold enough to make the air feel sharp in the back of the throat. Marin was up before Della, before Rue, before the light had fully arrived. She built up the stove, put the kettle on, and was standing at the window looking out at the valley when she heard Colt's boots on the porch. He came in, saw her standing there, and stopped. "Yes," she said, without turning around. He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "We'll need to go down before the pass closes for the winter. Next week. Caswell's making a supply run. I'll write to the county court to make sure the filing is done before the February date." Rue can witness. Good. She turned from the window and went to take the kettle off the stove. "Coffee?" "Please," he said, and sat down at the table. Outside the window, the first light was coming over the eastern ridge, turning the snow on the upper peaks from gray to the particular pale gold that meant the day was starting. Bucket barked once at something in the yard, a rabbit maybe, or just the morning itself, and then went quiet. The valley was cold and still and entirely itself, and Marin poured the coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across the table, and they drank it together while the light came in. They were married on a Tuesday in December, in the front room of the county clerk's office in a town called Delard, which was the closest place with the right paperwork and a notary willing to do the job on short notice. The room smelled of pipe smoke and old wood and the particular dusty formality of government buildings everywhere. Rue stood as witness and held his hat in both hands with the solemnity of a man attending a more significant occasion than anyone had asked him to attend. Caswell, who'd brought them down in his supply wagon, waited outside with the horses and didn't ask questions, which was why Colt had asked him to bring them in the first place. The clerk was a round-faced man named Oberst, who seemed neither surprised nor particularly interested, which was also fine. He read the words, they said the words back, Rue signed where he was told to sign, and that was it. The whole thing took 11 minutes. Marin knew because she'd been watching the clock on the wall behind Oberst's head, not out of impatience, but because she found, at certain significant moments, that her mind needed something factual to hold on to. 11 minutes to change the legal structure of her life. Afterward, on the boardwalk outside, Colt said, "There's a decent place down the block if you want a meal before we head back." "That would be good," she said. They had soup and bread at a table by the window. Rue ate his with the same expression he brought to everything. Della, who had been allowed to come, and who understood that something important had happened without fully grasping the particulars, ate her soup with great concentration and then looked up and said, to Colt, "Are you my papa now?" The table went quiet. Colt looked at the child with the careful attention he gave to anything that required an answer he wasn't certain of. "That's up to you," he said. Della considered this. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need," he said. She went back to her soup. Marin looked at the window and the street beyond it, a different street in a different town, and thought about 11 minutes and what they could and couldn't change, and whether the distinction between the two mattered as much as she'd always believed. The letter to Silas Hale's attorney went out the next day, filed through the county court in Faro, formally notifying them that the respondent, Marin Hale, was now Marin Mercer, a married woman residing with her husband and daughter at an established ranch property in the Northern Valley. and that the petition for guardianship should be reviewed in light of this changed circumstance. Marin wrote it herself, in her clearest hand, and sent a copy to the court and a copy to the attorney, and kept one for herself in the flour sack with the other papers. Then she went back to work, because the ranch did not pause for paperwork. The response came 6 weeks later, in late January, when the pass had been manageable enough for Caswell to make another run. 2 letters this time. The first was from the court in Faro, acknowledging the change in circumstances but noting that the petition would proceed as filed, the petitioner having amended his grounds to include concerns about the hasty nature of the marriage and its apparent convenience. The second letter was from Silas Hale himself. It was shorter than the legal letter and worse to read. He was a man who chose his words with deliberate care, the way you sharpen a blade carefully before you use it. He wrote that he bore Marin no personal ill will. He wrote that his concern was entirely for Della, who deserved a stable home with family who had known her father. He wrote that he hoped Marin would see reason before the court date, for everyone's sake. He wrote that courts tended to look unfavorably on arrangements that appeared to have been constructed primarily for legal advantage. That last line she read twice. "He's not wrong," she said. Colt was across the table from her. He'd read both letters and set them down with the flat expression he used when he was thinking hard and not ready to say what he was thinking. "He's anticipating the argument we'd make," he said, "which means he'll have a counter ready." "What's the counter?" "That the marriage is a legal maneuver, that it doesn't represent a genuine household." "And how do we counter the counter?" He looked at her steadily. "We prove it isn't." She thought about this. The ranch was real, the work was real, the root cellar she'd rebuilt, and the garden beds she'd turned, and the curtains on the windows. All of it real, all of it documented in the physical evidence of a household that functioned. But a court didn't walk through the root cellar. A court heard testimony, which meant witnesses, which meant people. "They'll bring people from Black Ridge," she said. It wasn't a question. She knew how these things worked. She'd watched them work around her for 4 months before she'd left. "Most likely," Colt said. "Hector Alderton. Sister Oaks, maybe. People who saw me at my lowest and are now going to be asked to describe it." She kept her voice even, though the thought of Hector Alderton's careful avoidance of her eyes being replayed in a courtroom, sat in her chest like something with weight. "They're not bad people. They'll just tell the truth as they saw it." "Then we need to be better prepared than the truth they saw," Colt said. She looked at him. "Meaning what?" "Meaning we need our own witnesses." He leaned forward slightly. "Rue's been ranching in this territory for 30 years. People know him. His word carries. There's also Caswell. He's made enough runs up here to speak to what the ranch looks like, what Della looks like, how the place is run." He paused. "And there's the judge. Courts don't just take testimony, they take the whole picture. And what does the whole picture look like right now?" "Better than it did," he said quietly. "A lot better than it did." She looked down at Silas's letter. He bore her no personal ill will. That particular phrase bothered her more than anything else in it because she believed him. She thought he genuinely didn't hate her, didn't want to hurt her. He just wanted what he wanted, and had decided that what stood between him and it was not a person, but a problem to be solved. That was its own kind of cruelty, the kind you couldn't argue with because it didn't think of itself as cruel. "February is 3 weeks," she said. "I know. We need to go down before then. Caswell can take us Thursday. The weather window looks reasonable." She folded both letters and put them in the flour sack. "All right," she said. "Thursday." They left Rue at the ranch. Someone had to stay with the animals and the property, and Caswell drove them down through the pass on a Thursday morning that was cold but clear, the sky that particular hard blue of high winter. Della sat between her parents on the wagon seat, which was how she'd taken to sitting on wagon rides, claiming the middle as simply her position without making any announcement about it. She had Bucket's old collar in her coat pocket, which she carried sometimes for reasons she hadn't explained and Marin hadn't pushed on. Dellard was the closest town with lodging of any kind, and they stayed 2 nights there before the court date in Faro. Marin used the time to walk through what she knew, go over the papers she'd brought, and try to sleep, which was the hardest of the 3. Colt slept across the hall. They'd taken 2 rooms, which was practical, and which neither of them had discussed. and she heard him up before light both mornings, moving around in that quiet, self-contained way he had. The night before the court date, he knocked on her door. She'd been awake, sitting at the small desk with the lamp low, looking at the papers without really seeing them. "Come in," she said. He stood in the doorway without crossing the threshold. He was still dressed. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she said, which was not entirely true, and which she thought he probably knew. "The lawyer Kessler found us. Pemberton." "I think he's good," Colt said. "He asked the right questions when we talked." "Did he seem worried?" Colt thought about it in that measured way. "He seemed realistic." She appreciated that. She didn't want to be told everything was going to be fine. She'd learned the cost of that particular kind of reassurance. "What's the weakest part of our case?" "The timing of the marriage," he said. "It's going to look like what it was. It was practical." "Yes, and a court might see practical as the same as artificial." She turned in the chair to face him more directly. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The arrangement, any part of it?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the door frame rather than her, and then at her. "No," he said. "Do you?" She thought about Della's color in the mountain air, about the root cellar and the kitchen garden, about 6 months of work that had built something out of nothing, and the paper in the flour sack that said Marin Mercer and meant the two of them stood between her daughter and a man who'd decided Della was a problem to be administered. "No," she said. He nodded. "Get some sleep if you can." "You too," she said. He pulled the door closed, and she listened to his footsteps go back down the hall, and then silence, and she sat with the lamp for a while longer before she finally put it out. The courthouse in Faro was a 2-story stone building with a plaque beside the door that had turned green. Judge Alma Whitfield presided, which Pemberton had mentioned as significant. He'd said she was known for being thorough and difficult to maneuver, which he considered a point in their favor. Marin hadn't been sure whether to find that reassuring, but she held on to it. Silas Hale was already in the room when they arrived. She hadn't seen him in almost a year, not since the funeral. He was a large man, broad-shouldered like Jonah, but heavier and more settled into himself, with the bearing of someone who'd been confident for so long he'd stopped having to perform it. He was well-dressed, not ostentatiously, but carefully, in the way that communicated resources and stability without announcing them. He had a lawyer beside him who was older than Pemberton and wore his experience like a coat that fit well. Silas looked at Marin when she came in. He didn't look at Colt. He looked at Marin with an expression that was almost regretful, almost apologetic, which made her feel worse than contempt would have. She looked back at him long enough to let him know she'd seen him, and then she sat down and looked at the judge's bench. Della had been left with the wife of the hotel owner in Dillard, which was the best option available. She was too young to be in the room for any of this, and old enough that she would understand later what had been decided here. The proceedings began. Silas's attorney, whose name was Colvert, opened by laying out the petition in the language courts preferred, measured, documented, each claim supported by something on paper. The debt record from Black Ridge, the removal from established residence, the original nature of Marin's employment at the ranch. And then, with a care that told Marin he'd practiced this, the matter of the marriage, filed 11 weeks after Mrs. Hale's arrival at the property, notably proximate to the date the petition had been served, a timeline that suggested not a genuine domestic union, but a strategic legal response. He called his first witness, Hector Alderton. The storekeeper from Black Ridge took the stand with the look of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. He answered Colvert's questions in a flat, careful voice. Yes, he'd known Mrs. Hale. Yes, there had been outstanding debt. Yes, she had come in asking for credit she could not be given. Yes, the account had remained unpaid at the time she left town. Colvert thanked him, and Pemberton stood. "Mr. Alderton," Pemberton said, "in your experience with Mrs. Hale as a customer, did she ever try to avoid paying what she owed?" Alderton shifted. "No. She simply didn't have the money." "That's right. Did you ever have reason to question her character, her honesty?" A pause. "No," Alderton said. "She was always honest about her situation. Was she ever anything other than honest with you?" "No." "Thank you," Pemberton said, and sat. Colvert called Sister Oakes next, who testified in the careful language of a woman who believed she was doing the right thing while doing a thing that didn't feel entirely right. She described Marin's visit to the charitable organization. She described the nature of the outstanding requests, the inability to assist. Pemberton's cross was brief. "Did Mrs. Hale ever strike you as an unfit mother?" "No," Sister Oakes said. She said it without hesitation, which seemed to surprise herself slightly. "Did she seem like a woman who was trying to provide for her child?" "Yes." "In difficult circumstances?" "Yes." "Thank you." The third witness Colvert called was a man Marin didn't recognize, a man named Pullum, who'd apparently done some business with Jonah and had opinions about his character and by extension about the judgment of the woman who'd married him. This testimony was thinner, and Pemberton handled it efficiently, establishing that Pullum had no personal knowledge of Marin's capacity as a mother and had not seen her in over a year. Then Colvert said, "The petitioner would like to make a brief statement." Judge Whitfield, who had been listening with an expression of focused neutrality throughout, nodded. Silas Hale stood. He was good at this, at seeming reasonable, at the precise calibration of a man presenting himself as a reluctant participant in something unfortunate. He talked about Jonah, about what a difficult man Jonah had been, how the family had tried to help, how things had not gone well. He talked about Della in the way a person does when they're describing someone they don't know well but have decided they have rights to. He talked about stability and about family and about what a child deserved. He did not raise his voice once. When he finished, Marin was called. She'd prepared for this. She'd sat with Pemberton for 2 hours the previous evening, going through every question he expected and several he didn't, and she'd answered them in her kitchen voice, the one that was direct and didn't inflate or apologize. She knew the value of that register. She'd used it to negotiate a fair salary and to tell Colt Mercer she needed to be sure of her own decisions and to run a household on cornmeal and dried beans when that was what there was. It was not a defensive voice. It was the voice of someone who knew what they'd done and why. Colvert opened with the debt, the house in Black Ridge, the circumstances of leaving. "My daughter was sick," Marin said. "She needed medicine and proper food, and I couldn't provide those things in Black Ridge. I found work that provided them. I took it." "And that work brought you to Mr. Mercer's property?" "Yes." "As a paid employee?" "Yes." "And shortly after arriving, you married your employer?" 6 weeks after. She looked at him evenly. "I won't pretend the timing was coincidental. The petition was served. I was living on a man's property as an unmarried woman, which was going to be used against me in exactly the way you're using it now. The marriage was practical, but practical doesn't mean it isn't real." "Can you explain what you mean by real, Mrs. Mercer?" She thought for a moment. "The ranch needed work when I arrived. I did the work, not because I was told to, or because it was in the terms of my employment, but because I'm someone who takes care of things that need taking care of. The root cellar, the garden, the outbuildings, the livestock, all of it is in better condition than it was. I didn't do that to look good for a court. I did it because that's what you do when you live somewhere and intend to stay." Colvert changed angles. "Your daughter has been living in relative isolation, away from community, from schooling." "I teach her," Marin said. "Every evening, reading, arithmetic, geography. Her numbers are ahead of where they should be for her age, and she reads at a level most children 2 years older can't match." A beat. "She's also healthy. Her color's good. She gained weight after we reached the ranch. The fever that brought her near to, that's gone and it hasn't come back, because she has adequate food and shelter and a warm place to sleep. That's what I've provided." She held Colvert's gaze and didn't look away. Pemberton's direct examination was the better conversation. He took her through the specifics of the ranch, what she'd done, how it had improved, the testimony Rue and Caswell would provide about the condition of the property now versus when she'd arrived. He asked about Colt. "Describe your husband's relationship with your daughter," he said. She thought about the arithmetic lesson, about Della asking if she could think about it, about the dog named Bucket and the barn cats called Albert and Agnes, about a man who'd driven her and her sick daughter 30 miles into the mountains and put a plate of food on the table and washed his own dish without being asked and never once made her feel like a charity case. "He's patient with her," she said. He takes her questions seriously. He doesn't talk down to her. She paused. That matters more than most people think it does. And their relationship has developed naturally, over time? Yes. She thought of Della in the middle of the wagon seat, claiming her position without announcing it. She's decided things for herself. She's that kind of child. Pemberton nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Mercer. Colt took the stand in the afternoon, after the lunch recess during which no one ate much of anything. He was not a man built for courtrooms in the sense that courtrooms preferred a certain kind of ease with public presentation, and he didn't have it. He sat straight and answered in plain sentences and didn't embellish or minimize, and what came across, which Marin thought might be the most useful thing he could convey, was a complete absence of pretense. You couldn't listen to Colt Mercer and think, this man is performing something. He was simply too indifferent to the performance. Colvert tried several approaches. The speed of the marriage, the nature of the arrangement, whether Colt had anticipated, when he hired Marin, that the situation might develop as it had. No, Colt said. I needed someone who could run a kitchen and a household. She could. That's why I hired her. And the marriage? Was the right thing to do, Colt said, for the circumstances and for her and for the child. I don't see why that's a problem. The timing was what it was, Colt said. The situation required a decision, and we made one. I've made faster decisions with less information and been worse off. This one I'm comfortable with. Colvert shifted. Mr. Mercer, you've lived alone on that property for 6 years prior to Mrs. Hale's arrival. That's right. You had no previous relationship with her? No. No family connection, no history? No. Doesn't that strike you as an unusual basis for a marriage? Colt looked at the attorney with the expression he used when a question contained an assumption he didn't agree with and wasn't going to argue with either. Most things worth having, he said, start out unfamiliar. Colvert paused, then moved on. Rue testified after Colt, and he was in his way the most effective witness because he had no stake that anyone in the courtroom could identify. He was an old man who worked on a ranch and had watched a woman arrive with a sick child and turn a neglected property into something that ran well, and he said all of this in the flat, unadorned way he said everything, and it landed without decoration. Would you say Mrs. Mercer is a capable woman? Pemberton asked him. More capable than most, Rue said. More capable than anyone that ranch has had running it in a while. And the child? Della. Have you observed her in the household? Rue considered. She's a good child. She's got her mother's sense. She pays attention, and she doesn't complain when there's no reason to complain. A pause. She named my barn cats. Good names. One of the court observers made a sound that was almost a laugh and quickly wasn't. Caswell testified about the supply runs, what the ranch had looked like in October versus what it looked like now. The improvement documented in the plainest commercial terms of a man who dealt in supplies and could tell you exactly what a household needed and whether it had it. Then Judge Whitfield set aside the witness format. I'd like to speak with the child, she said. The room shifted. Colvert started to object on grounds of the child's age, but Judge Whitfield looked at him over her glasses with an expression that explained, without words, that she hadn't been asking. Della was brought from Dillard by the hotel owner's wife. She arrived in the afternoon looking composed and slightly formal in the way she got when she understood that adults expected a certain behavior from her, and had decided to provide it without being asked. She was wearing her good dress, and her hair was in the braid Marin always did for her. Not perfectly, because Marin's braiding had never been her best skill, which Della had noted diplomatically on more than one occasion. Judge Whitfield spoke with her in the clerk's anteroom, without lawyers or parents, with only the court stenographer present. Marin sat in the courtroom and looked at the door and did not allow her hands to shake, which required more active effort than she would have admitted. The wait was 20 minutes. When Della came back out, she looked unruffled. She found her mother's eyes immediately, and something in her face said, "It's all right." Not with words. She was 5. She didn't have the vocabulary for legal reassurance, but in the way she walked back to sit beside Marin and pressed close and went about the business of existing beside her as if this were simply the next ordinary moment. Judge Whitfield returned to the bench. She didn't announce her ruling immediately. She looked at the room, at both tables, at the assembled faces. with the expression of someone who'd done this long enough to have developed specific opinions about specific categories of human behavior. "I want to address the matter of timing directly," she said, "because it's been the center of the petitioner's case. Yes, the marriage occurred shortly after the petition was served. I have no doubt this was not a coincidence. But a strategic decision is not the same as a fraudulent one. People make decisions in response to circumstances. That is what decisions are. The question before me is not whether the Mercers' marriage was convenient, but whether it is a genuine household, and whether that household serves the welfare of this child." She looked down at her notes. "I spoke with Della Hale, Della Mercer, at some length. I won't reproduce the content of that conversation. I'll say only that she is a clear-minded child who answered my questions directly and without prompting, and whose account of her own life was consistent, specific, and entirely her own. She did not perform happiness. She described it. The room was very quiet. The petition for guardianship is denied. Costs to the petitioner." Marin heard it, and then heard the silence around it, and then heard Colt, beside her, exhale slowly through his nose. That was all. The room began to move again, papers being gathered, chairs being pushed, the ordinary sounds of a proceeding ending. Colvert spoke quietly to Silas. Silas stood very still, looking at the judge's bench, and then he looked at Marin. She looked back at him. She didn't have an expression for the moment. She hadn't prepared one. She was just a woman sitting in a courtroom in February who had her daughter and her household and the paper in her flour sack that said what it said. Silas looked away first. He picked up his coat and left through the side door without speaking, Colvert close behind. Pemberton was talking, something about the formal paperwork and the next steps, and Marin heard him and would remember what he said. But in that moment she was watching the side door close behind Silas Hale and feeling something that took her a minute to identify. Not triumph, not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. Something quieter than both. Something that felt like the floor under her feet being solid, the actual physical floor, the stone courthouse floor under the wooden chair legs under her. Just solid, just there. She turned and found Colt watching her. His expression was what it usually was. Level, contained, but there was something around the edges of it that she'd learned to read over the months, a quality that meant he was feeling something he wasn't sure how to say. "It's over," she said. "The court part is," he said. "Yes," she said. "The court part." Della had been brought back into the room during the judge's ruling, and she was now standing at the end of the row, watching the room clear out with the attentive patience of someone waiting for the adults to be finished so everyone could go. She had Bucket's collar out of her pocket and was turning it in her fingers the way she did when she was thinking. Marin stood and went to her. She crouched down to her daughter's level, which she rarely did anymore because Della had opinions about being treated like she was younger than she was, but right now felt like an exception. "Are you all right?" she asked. Della considered her. "The judge asked me about Bucket," she said. "What did you say?" "I said he was old but still very fast when he wanted to be." She paused. She laughed. Marin looked at her daughter, this small, particular, entirely her own person, and felt the full weight of the last several months arrive in her chest all at once. The 39 cents and the condensed milk, and the wagon seat going north, and the months of work, and the letter from Silas, and the 11 minutes in the county clerk's office, and all of it, landing here in this courtroom in February with her daughter standing before her with a dog collar in her hands. "We're going home," Marin said. Della nodded. Then she looked past her mother at Colt, who had come to stand behind them. She looked at him for a moment with that wide-spaced, serious, assessing gaze. "Are we going back to the ranch?" she asked him. "Yes," he said. She slipped the collar back into her pocket. "Good," she said. "I want to see if Agnes had her kittens yet." She walked toward the door. Colt looked at Marin. Marin stood up. They looked at each other in the quiet courthouse room with the light coming through the high windows and the sound of Della's boots on the floor going toward the exit. And neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything that needed saying that wasn't already clear. Then Marin picked up her coat from the chair and put it on, and they followed their daughter out into the February afternoon. Agnes had not had her kittens yet. This was Della's first and most pressing concern when they arrived back at the ranch 2 days after the ruling, coming through the pass in Caswell's wagon, in the kind of late winter light that was more silver than gold, the valley floor still holding its snow in the shaded places, while the south-facing slopes had begun to show patches of bare ground. Rue met them at the barn. He'd seen the wagon coming down the ridge, and before anyone had finished climbing down, Della had asked her question, and Rue had provided his answer, which was, any day now, probably tonight. Della's response to this was to go directly to the barn to begin her vigil. Caswell helped unload the bags and declined the offer of supper with the easy manner of a man who had other stops to make and other people's business to leave behind him. He drove off down the valley road while Marin stood on the porch and watched the wagon diminish in the gray afternoon. There was a particular quality to coming back to a place after you'd been away fighting for it. Everything looked more specific somehow, more deliberately itself. The stone foundation of the house, the curtains she'd made from flour sacking visible through the kitchen window, the stacked wood by the back door she'd helped split in November, a task she'd been bad at initially and merely competent at now. It was hers. The court had said so in the only language that mattered to courts, but she'd known it before the court said anything. The knowing had started in December when she'd turned the garden beds north-south in the cold and her hands had ached, and she'd done it anyway. Colt came up beside her on the porch. He'd been talking to Rue about something she hadn't caught. He stood looking at the same piece of the valley she was looking at, and for a while neither of them said anything. The south fence Rue patched. The wire didn't hold, he said finally. When? 2 weeks ago, by the look of it. He did what he could, but it needs proper work in spring. All right, she said, and the smokehouse chimney has a crack. I can see it from here. She looked, and yes, there it was. A dark line in the stone she hadn't noticed before they'd left. That'll need to be done before the next cure. Probably April. She exhaled. He exhaled. The valley lay before them with its list of things that needed doing, same as it always did and always would, which was the most honest thing about it. We should go in, she said. It's getting cold. Yes, he said, and held the door for her, and they went inside. The first letter arrived from Pemberton 3 weeks after the ruling, the formal notification that the judgment had been recorded and that Silas Hale's attorney had filed no appeal. That was the legal end of it, the period at the end of a sentence that had been hanging open since December. Marin read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning, set it in the flour sack with the others, and went back to what she'd been doing, which was mending a tear in one of Colt's work shirts. Colt came in from the morning feed and saw the letter on the table before she moved it. He picked it up and read it without sitting down. No appeal, he said. No appeal. He set it down. He looked like he wanted to say something more and wasn't sure what. Good, he said finally, which was less than what she thought he was feeling, but probably accurate as a summary. Pemberton said the court costs go to Silas. That's $300 in legal fees. Justice has a price. It does, she said. Luckily it was his this time. Something moved in his expression. Are you all right? With all of it? Now that it's settled. She kept her eyes on the mending. I will be, she said. I'm not entirely there yet, but I'm getting there. He nodded. He understood the distinction, she thought. He was a man who'd had his own things to get through. He didn't press. What is there yet? He asked. Not pushing. More like he was willing to hear it if she wanted to say it. She put the shirt down and looked at the window, at the valley going about its February business outside. I keep thinking about Hector Alderton on the stand. The way he looked when Pemberton asked if I was honest. How long it took him to say yes. She paused. It wasn't a hard question. It shouldn't have taken him that long. He was in a difficult position. He was in the position he chose, she said. Not bitterly, just accurately. When I walked into his store with 39 cents and a sick child, he could have made a different choice. Any of them could have. Sister Oaks, the widow Pressler with her full woodpile. She picked up the shirt again. They didn't. And then they came into a courtroom and testified, carefully and honestly, that I wasn't a bad person after all, and that was supposed to help me. Colt sat down across from her. It did help you. I know. She pulled the thread through. That's what bothers me. He thought about this for a moment. You'd rather have not needed it. I'd rather have not needed any of it, she said. The marriage, the court, the witnesses. I'd rather Silas Hale had looked at his brother's widow and his brother's daughter and made a different calculation. She stopped. But that's not the world. No, he said. It's not. They sat in the quiet of the kitchen for a moment, the stove ticking, Della's voice audible from outside, where she was conducting some kind of negotiation with Bucket involving a stick and a set of rules only she fully understood. The widow Pressler, Colt said. You mentioned her before. Old friend, more or less. You think about going back? She looked at him. To Black Ridge? Not to live. But there are things unresolved. She thought about it. She thought about the street and the boardwalk and the sign above Alderton's store, and the way none of it had felt like hers by the end. No, she said. Not to resolve anything there. There's nothing to go back and fix. She went back to the mending. What's here is what I'm building. I'm not interested in rebuilding what was. He seemed to take this in. That's a clear way to think about it. I've had time to get clear, she said, about a lot of things. He looked at her with the careful attention he brought to things that mattered to him and didn't say it. And she understood, the way she'd been learning to understand him over these months, that the attention itself was the statement. Colt Mercer was not a man who said everything he meant, but he meant what he said and he showed what he meant, and she was learning to read the second register as fluently as the first. She tied off the thread and set the shirt on the finished pile, picked up the next thing, a strap from Della's satchel that had pulled loose from its buckle. The fence, she said. South section. What's the full extent of the damage? He blinked, shifted gears without complaint. 3 posts are rotted at the base. The wire's salvageable, but the posts need replacing. Before the thaw? Before the cattle get ideas, he said, which was his way of saying the same thing. Rue's knee is bad this week. I know. I can help with the posts. I've done it before. He looked at her. It's cold work. I know what cold work is, she said, with enough evenness that he heard the rebuke in it without it being a rebuke, just a statement about what she knew of herself. He nodded once and dropped it. Saturday, he said. If the weather holds. Saturday, she agreed. Optic. Agnes delivered 4 kittens on a Wednesday night in early March, 2 gray and 2 with markings that suggested a father of unknown and adventurous background. Della was present for this event and reported on it in considerable detail at the breakfast table the next morning with the thoroughness of someone filing an official record. She had names prepared. Rue, who had also apparently been present, confirmed the details without elaboration, which was his version of endorsement. March moved through in the specific rhythm that the valley had. Cold mornings giving way to afternoons that almost convinced you it was spring, and then evenings that reminded you it wasn't. The snow came off the lower slopes and the creek ran high and brown with it, and the mud season arrived with its usual suggestions about what boots were really for. Colt and Marin fixed the south fence in 2 days of work that were as cold as he'd warned and more difficult than either of them had anticipated because 2 of the bad posts had been in longer than anyone knew, and the roots had done things to the surrounding ground that required a level of argument Marin hadn't expected to have with frozen soil. She did the work. Her back hurt for 3 days afterward, and she said nothing about this, and neither did he. But she caught him watching her one evening when she sat down too carefully, and there was something in his face that was concerned trying to be casual. I'm fine, she said, before he asked. I didn't say anything. You were about to. He was quiet. Then, the posts on the east line are probably the same. We'll do them in April, she said, when the ground is softer. That would be better, he agreed. There was a particular intimacy that developed between 2 people who worked a piece of land together through the difficulty of the hard months. Not romantic necessarily, not dramatic, but built of specific knowledge. She knew how he moved when he was tired versus when he was thinking. He knew how her voice changed when she was at the end of her patience with something and was pushing past it rather than stopping. She knew he'd been hurt in his left shoulder at some point because of the way he favored it when the temperature dropped, and he'd mentioned it exactly once and then never again. He knew she kept the coffee stronger than most people liked it, and that she got quiet rather than short-tempered when something was wrong, which made her harder to read on bad days but easier to be around. She knew he'd lost someone. She didn't know who or when or how. There were signs of it, the way he'd answered Della's question in the soup restaurant, the particular angle of the silence when certain subjects came near. She didn't push on it. She understood the value of that particular door staying closed until the person inside decided to open it. In April, a rider came up from the valley. He was young, not more than 20, and he rode a good horse with better care than his clothes suggested, which told her something. He asked for Marin Mercer, and she came to the door and stood there with her apron on, and her hands still dusty from the garden bed she'd been working. He handed her a letter. Formal, sealed, Silas Hale. She didn't open it in front of the rider. She gave him water for his horse and a biscuit for himself and waited until he'd gone back down the road before she took the letter to the table. Colt was at the barn. She went and got him. They read it together. It was not a legal letter this time. No law office return address, no formal language. It was Silas Hale's own handwriting, which she recognized from the card he'd sent after Jonah's funeral. A large hand, careful, the kind of penmanship taught by someone who believed it mattered. He wrote that he had had time to consider the court's ruling and his own actions leading to it. He wrote that he had allowed his conviction about what was best for Della to override his attention to what Marin might need to hear from a family member. He wrote that this had been a mistake. He used the word mistake directly and without qualification, which she noticed because it was not an easy word for men like Silas to arrive at. He wrote that he understood if she had no interest in further contact. He wrote that if she was willing, he would like to know his niece, in whatever way Marin saw fit, on whatever terms she set. He wrote that the land claim in Della's name was rightfully hers, and that he had no further intentions regarding it. He wrote one more thing. Near the bottom of the page, in a paragraph she read twice, Jonah was not an easy brother to have. I spent a long time angry at the ways he failed, and not long enough considering what it must have been like to be the person trying to hold things together beside him. I should have offered that to you instead of a petition. Marin set the letter on the table. Colt had been reading beside her, and he straightened now and stood looking at the window. Well, he said. Yes, she said. What do you want to do with it? She didn't answer immediately. She thought about the man in the courtroom with his careful, regretful expression. She thought about what it cost a man like that to write a paragraph about his own failures in his own handwriting. She thought about Jonah, who'd been dead for almost a year now, and about what it meant to have loved a difficult person and what it meant to have been the difficult person's wife, which was not the same thing, but carried its own weight. I'll write back, she said, not to give him anything, just to leave the door open. Colt looked at her. That's generous. It's practical, she said. Della will have questions about her father eventually. She'll want to know where she comes from. Silas knew Jonah for 40 years. I knew him for 7. She picked up the letter, folded it. That's a resource, if it can be made to work. If, Colt said. Yes, she said. If. She wrote back 3 days later. In her own careful hand, she wrote that she had received his letter and read it. She wrote that she appreciated the honesty of it. She wrote that she was willing to allow correspondence and that if he wished to meet Della, that could be discussed in time, and that time was the operative word. She would not be hurrying it, and neither should he. She wrote that the land claim would remain in Della's name, which he'd already said, but she wanted to say it back so it was clear they understood each other. She wrote that she had no interest in relitigating the past and no ability to pretend it hadn't happened, and that those two things would have to coexist for anything to work between them. She signed it Marin Mercer. She held the pen over the signature for a moment, looking at the name. Then she sealed the letter and gave it to Rue to take down on his next trip to the valley, which was Wednesday, and that was that. Spring came properly in May, the way it does at elevation, abrupt and earnest after all the cold had made its point. The snowpack melted off the upper ridges, and the creek ran hard for 2 weeks, and then settled back into itself. The garden beds that Marin had turned in the fall showed the first green of what she'd planted in those beds before the ground froze. The garlic coming up earliest, then the onions, then the beginning of what would be beans and squash by summer. She stood in the garden one morning in May, in the early light before breakfast, looking at those rows, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel this particular morning. Not happiness exactly, still not quite that word, but something adjacent to it, something that had mass and warmth. She'd planted those seeds in October. She'd worked that ground by herself, with her back aching and her hands raw, because she'd looked at the neglected kitchen garden and understood that the next person who would be eating from it was her and her daughter, and the old man with the bad knee, and the man who'd put $1 on a postbox and meant it, and they all deserved a garden that produced something. The seeds didn't know any of that. They'd grown because she'd done the work. She thought about what that meant, about the difference between wanting something to change and doing the work that changes it, which sounded obvious but wasn't. She'd spent 4 months in Black Ridge knowing the distinction intellectually, while the actual closing of the gap between what she had and what she needed felt impossible. Then one afternoon, a stranger put $1 on a postbox and said, "You look like someone who does what she says she'll do," and the gap had narrowed to something she could cross. The door opened behind her, and she heard Della come out, still in her sleeping clothes with her coat thrown over them, the same way she'd gone to the barn that first morning to find Bucket. The child came and stood beside her and looked at the garden rows. "Are those the beans?" "Those ones, yes." "When can we eat them?" "Late summer." Della accepted this timeline without complaint, which she wouldn't have done a year ago. Something in the mountain living had given her a different relationship with time, with the understanding that some things moved at the speed they moved, and you worked with that rather than against it. Or maybe she'd always had it, and Marin just hadn't been in a position to see it. "Mama," Della said, "is Silas my uncle?" Marin looked at her daughter. "Yes. He's your father's brother." "Is he a good person?" Marin thought about the letter. The word mistake, used without qualification. "I should have offered that to you." "I don't know yet," she said. "I think he's trying to be." "That's something," Della said, with the equanimity of someone who decided to accept partial credit. "It is," Marin agreed. Della looked at the garden for another moment. "I'm going to check on Agnes," she announced, and went toward the barn. Marin watched her go. This child who'd been sick in a back bedroom with 39 cents standing between her and something better, who was now sturdy and particular and absolutely herself in the mountain morning, who told a judge about a dog with a gray muzzle and made her laugh. She went inside to start breakfast. It was a Tuesday in May, almost a year to the week since the morning in Black Ridge when Marin had stood at Alderton's counter with 3 coins in her hand, that Colt came in from the evening feed later than usual and stood in the kitchen doorway with something in his expression she hadn't seen before, or had seen in pieces, but not assembled quite like this. Della was already asleep. Rue was in his cabin. The house was in its evening quiet. "Sit," Marin said, and brought the coffee without asking. He sat. He held the mug and looked at it for a moment. "I want to tell you something," he said. "About before." She sat down across from him and didn't say anything. This was the door she'd known was there. She waited. "I had a wife," he said, "in New Mexico. Her name was Clara." He said the name the way you say a name you've said to yourself many times in private, careful, like it still had edges. "She died 7 years ago, in March. The same year I came up here." "I'm sorry," Marin said. She meant it plainly, without inflation. "She was sick for a long time before." He turned the mug. "The kind of sick where you know how it ends, but you don't know when, and the waiting of it does something to you." He stopped. "I came up here because I needed a place where I didn't know every corner, where nothing had her in it. And this place was that." "It was." He looked up. "It's been good for that. But it's also been... It gets too empty after a while. The quiet changes what it is. You stop wanting it and start just having it." She thought about the conversation in the kitchen in December, when she'd asked if he regretted the arrangement. He'd said no, and she'd believed him, but she hadn't understood fully what the no encompassed. She was beginning to understand now. "Clara," she said, "was she—" She stopped, not sure how to ask what she was asking. "Practical," he said, with what was almost a smile. "Very." He looked at the table. "You're not like her. You're different kind of practical." He frowned slightly, as if hearing how that sounded. "I mean that—" "I know what you mean," she said. He looked at her directly. "I want you to know that when I offered you the job, I didn't have any—" He stopped again. He was not good at this, she thought, and it was one of the more honest things she'd seen from him. "I didn't have intentions." "I know," she said. "I didn't either." "Things change," he said. Slowly, And then they're changed. She looked at him across the table, at the man who'd been driving toward this valley for 7 years to outrun something and had gotten there and done the work of surviving it and come out the other side into a different kind of quiet. At the man who washed his own dish and helped with the root cellar and sat at the back of the room during Della's lessons and said, "Start with the bigger number and count back, because someone told me once." His mother, long ago. "Yes," she said. "They do." The lamp on the table threw its small circle of light. Outside, the May dark had come down over the valley, and somewhere in the barn Bucket was settled in his spot by the door, and Agnes was in the hayloft with 4 kittens of uncertain parentage, and the garden was doing what the garden did at night, quietly, without help, the way things grow when you've done the work and stepped back. "I'm not going to make you a speech," Colt said. "I don't have one." "Good," Marin said. "I don't need one." He nodded. She could see him working through the arithmetic of what to say next and coming up short, which she decided to help him with. "We're already in it," she said. "We have been for a while. I think we can stop pretending we don't know that." He looked at her. The thing around the edges of his expression that she'd been reading for months was clearer tonight, less guarded, less managed, just there. "That's a practical way to look at it," he said. "I'm a practical woman," she said. "You are," he said. "Among other things." She stood and took the coffee pot from the stove and refilled both mugs and sat back down. He watched her do this with the look of a man who'd watched a woman move through his kitchen every day for 7 months, and only tonight was letting himself see it for exactly what it was. "The east fence posts," she said. "We never finished those." "No," he said. "We didn't." "Saturday," she said, "if the weather holds." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with something in his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. "Saturday," he said. The fire in the stove settled. The valley was dark and quiet and entirely their own. Marin wrapped her hands around her mug and felt the warmth of it move through her palms and thought, "This is what it is. Not smooth, not finished, not the end of difficulty because difficulty didn't end. It just changed its address, but solid. But real, but hers." That was enough. For tonight, that was more than enough. The east fence post got done on a Saturday, as agreed, in weather that held just long enough to finish the work and then turn mean in the last hour. A cold May rain coming down off the north ridge in the way mountain weather does when it decides to remind you who's in charge. They finished the last post in it, both of them soaked through by the time they got back to the barn, and Marin stood inside the barn door wringing out her braid, while Colt put up the tools with the systematic thoroughness of a man who believed that putting things away properly was the difference between a working ranch and a slowly failing one. Rue was waiting in his kitchen with the stove fed high and coffee on, which was the most direct expression of care the old man was capable of, and which they'd both learned to receive without comment. Della was at the table with her slate, working through a geography problem Marin had set her that morning, and she looked up when they came in dripping and said, with the frank assessment of a child who'd grown up around working people, "You both look terrible." "Thank you," Marin said, and went to change. That was May. June came and the garden came with it. Not in the dramatic overnight way that first-time gardeners expect, but in the incremental daily way of things that are doing exactly what they're supposed to do and don't require an audience for it. The garlic went tall and then bent, which meant it was ready. The beans came in all at once, the way beans always do, abundantly and without warning, so that Marin spent 3 days in a row picking and processing and filling jars until her hands were stained and her back made its opinions known. The squash took longer. Everything took its own time, and nothing consulted anyone about the schedule. She'd started keeping a record that summer. Not a diary, nothing personal, just a working ledger of the garden. What she'd planted when it had come in, what had worked and what hadn't, what she'd do differently. It was the kind of document you wrote for the person you'd be next year, who would need to know what this year's person had learned. She'd never had the luxury of thinking that far ahead before. It was a new kind of thinking, and she was still getting used to it. Colt found her at it one evening in June, the ledger open on the table beside the lamp, her notes small and precise in the margins. "What's that?" he said. "Garden record?" He looked over her shoulder at it. She felt him reading. "You're noting the soil amendments by bed. If I don't, I'll forget by spring and repeat the same mistakes." That's thorough. It's practical, she said, which was their word now, the one that had accumulated meaning over the months until it contained more than its dictionary definition. He touched her shoulder briefly as he moved past toward the basin. Nothing declared, just the ordinary touch of two people who'd gotten used to each other's presence in a particular space, and she went back to her notes. The summer brought visitors. Not many. The valley's isolation was a fact of geography that hadn't changed, but a few. Caswell came monthly with supplies and occasional news from the lower country. A neighboring rancher named Hargrove, whose property was 6 miles to the southeast, rode up in July to talk about the water rights on the creek that ran between their properties. A conversation that had apparently been needed for years and kept being deferred. Marin made coffee and sat at the table during this conversation without being invited to, and contributed 2 observations about the drainage pattern she'd noticed from the garden work, both of which turned out to be relevant, and Hargrove looked at her with the mild surprise of a man recalibrating his assumptions about who he was actually negotiating with. They reached an agreement before he left, which Colt told her afterward was more than he'd expected to happen in one visit. "What did you expect?" she asked. Hargrove usually needs 3 meetings to agree on anything. He just needed someone to show him the practical route, she said. The water doesn't care about the property line. It goes where it goes. You work with that or you fight it, and fighting it costs everyone. Colt looked at her. You should have been a lawyer. I should have been several things, she said. I ended up here. He was quiet for a moment, and something in that quiet said, and I'm glad you did. In the register he used for things he meant but didn't announce. She heard it. She'd gotten good at that. Hargrove came back in August with his wife, a substantial woman named Vera, who had opinions about everything and expressed them without hesitation, which Marin found immediately refreshing after a year of the Valley's particular brand of reticence. Vera walked through the kitchen garden with her hands on her hips and her head tilted and said, Who turned these beds north-south? That's correct. Most people don't bother. I did, Marin said. Vera looked at her with the expression of someone who'd just found an unexpected ally. Rue mentioned there was a woman up here who actually knew what she was doing. I didn't believe him entirely. Rue said that. He said, and I'm quoting, she's not useless. That's high praise from Rue. Marin thought about the morning she'd reset the garden stakes in the cold while Rue watched and nodded once and walked away. High praise was relative. He's been helpful, she said. He's been ranching this valley since before most of these trees, Vera said. She picked up a bean pod, examined it, set it down. You've done good work here. Real work, not the performative kind. It was the first time anyone had said this to her directly who didn't have a stake in saying it. Not Colt, who had reasons to mean it. Not Rue, who communicated approval through the absence of correction. Not Caswell, who was too polite. Vera Hargrove had no reason to say it except that it was true. And that particular calibration of truth landed differently than the other kinds. Thank you, Marin said, and meant it simply. Vera stayed for supper and talked through it, and stayed until the evening was fully dark, and Hargrove had to gently redirect them toward the ride home. Della had attached herself to Vera with the instinct she had for people who would engage with her seriously, and Vera had obliged, discussing with complete earnestness the relative merits of Albert versus Agnes as a name for a cat. When they left, Della stood on the porch and watched until the lamp of their lantern disappeared down the valley road. I like her, Della said. So do I, Marin said. Can she come back? I expect she'll be back whether we invite her or not, Marin said, which was accurate, and Vera did come back in September and again in October, and each time she and Marin talked longer and covered more ground. And somewhere in the accumulation of those conversations, something happened that Marin hadn't had since the early years in Black Ridge before things had gone wrong. She had a friend. She didn't know how to name it at first. She'd stopped expecting it, but it was there. The particular ease of a person whose company didn't cost you anything, who took you as you were without requiring explanation or performance, who laughed at the same things and pushed back on the others, and remembered what you'd told her and asked about it the next time. It was ordinary. It was also extraordinary because she'd gone long enough without it to know the difference. September of that year, the first letter came from Silas. He'd written once in June, brief, careful, asking after Della without asking too much, noting that he was well, and that the season was dry where he was. Marin had written back in the same register. Brief, civil, offering a sentence about Della's lessons and a sentence about the garden, and nothing more. They were still building the road between them one stone at a time, and neither of them was in a hurry to pretend it was finished. The September letter was different. He wrote that he'd been going through Jonah's things, belongings that had ended up with him after the settlement, boxes he'd been avoiding for over a year. He'd found something he thought Della should have eventually when she was old enough, a journal Jonah had kept, not regularly, just intermittently, the kind of record that accumulates in fits and starts over years. He asked if Maren would like him to send it. She thought about this for a long time before she answered. Jonah had been difficult was the word she kept coming back to, the same one Silas had used about him in the courtroom letter, the word that was true and also insufficient because it didn't contain the other things he'd been. Funny, sometimes, in the way that made you laugh when you hadn't expected to, capable of tenderness in small, infrequent moments that had been enough to keep her beside him through the larger failures. A man who genuinely believed each new plan was the one that would work, which was tragic but not dishonest. He hadn't been lying to her, she'd come to understand. He'd been lying to himself, which was a different and in some ways sadder thing. Della would ask about him, was already asking, in the indirect way of a child who senses the edges of something she's not yet ready to walk toward directly. She'd asked once, in July, whether her father had liked horses. Maren had said yes. He'd been good with them, which was true. Della had absorbed this and moved on and asked about something else. But Maren had felt the question sitting there, waiting for more answers when the child was ready to hold them. The journal was Jonah's actual voice. Whatever was in it, the plans, the hopes, the language of a man who couldn't stop believing the next thing would save him, it was his. Not a second-hand account, not Maren's version or Silas's, but his own record of himself. She wrote back, "Yes, please send it." She would keep it until Della was ready for it. The journal arrived in October, a thick, battered thing with a cloth cover that had faded from what had probably been blue to something between gray and nothing. She held it in her hands for a while before she put it in the flour sack. No longer just a flour sack, but the proper document box she'd made space for on the high shelf, with the other papers. The birth record, the land claim, the marriage certificate, the court ruling, a letter from Silas that she'd kept because of one paragraph in it, the record of a life, or the beginning of one. Autumn moved through with the directness that the high country preferred. No prolonged autumn sentimentality, just the sudden drop in temperature and the color change that went from green to gold to bare. In what felt like 2 weeks, the aspen stands on the valley slopes going the particular yellow that was so vivid it looked artificial. Maren had seen 4 seasons in this valley now. She was starting to know its personality, the specific way it moved through a year, the things that were reliable and the things that weren't. One afternoon in October, she was in the garden pulling the last of the season, the winter squash she'd been watching for 3 weeks, waiting for the stems to go woody, when she heard Della call from the direction of the porch. The child's voice had a specific quality when it was reporting something important versus when it was simply reporting, and this was the important register. She came around the side of the house and saw a rider in the yard. It took her a moment to recognize him because she'd only seen him 3 times and never outside of formal settings. But the bearing was unmistakable, that broad-shouldered, settled-into-himself quality that she'd watched across a courtroom table 8 months ago. Silas Hale had come in person. He'd gotten off his horse and was standing at a respectful distance from the house with his hat in his hands, which she thought was deliberate. Della was on the porch looking at him with the calculating neutrality she brought to all new assessments. Maren crossed the yard. She stopped a few feet from him. He looked older than the courtroom. Or maybe she was just seeing him outside of the context that had compressed everything into its most adversarial version, and in ordinary light he was simply a man in his late 40s who'd done something he regretted and had traveled to say so in person. "I should have written first," he said. "I know." "Yes," she said, "you should have. I was in the valley below, and I thought—" He stopped. "I wanted to ask if I could see her, just for an hour. Out here, with you present." He looked at her steadily. "Your terms, Mrs. Mercer. Same as the letter." She looked at him for a long moment. At the hat in his hands, which he was holding the same way Rue had held his at the county clerk's office. Not out of performance, but out of the uncertainty of a man in a situation that required more of him than he was sure he had. She turned. "Della," she said, "come down here." Della came off the porch with the measured dignity of someone who'd been managing adults her whole life and had opinions about how this should go. She stopped beside her mother and looked at Silas. "You're my father's brother," she said. "That's right," Silas said. "Mama showed me a picture. You look older now." Something moved in Silas's face that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be. "That tends to happen," he said. Della considered him. "Did you know him well, my father?" "All my life," Silas said. "We grew up together." "Was he funny?" Silas blinked. "Yes," he said, with a quality of surprise that suggested the question had reached something real. "He was very funny, actually. He had a way of... He could make anyone laugh, even when things were bad. Especially when things were bad." Della nodded slowly. She filed this away with the visible deliberateness of someone updating a ledger. Then she looked at her mother. "Can he stay for supper?" Marin looked at Silas. Silas looked back at her with an expression that said he understood he had no standing here, that this was not his to decide, that he'd been offered something he hadn't expected and wasn't going to presume on it. "Colt will be in from the range by 5, Marin said. "If you want to wait, you're welcome to." "I'll wait," he said. She nodded toward the porch. "There's a chair there. Della can show you where the water is." She went back to the garden and the winter squash and let the afternoon do what it was going to do. She could hear, at intervals, Della's voice and then Silas's. Not what they said, just the pattern of it. Question and answer and question. The way the child pulled information from adults she'd decided were worth the effort. She thought about the journal on the high shelf, Jonah's faded cloth cover. She thought about what it meant to give a child not just the future, but the complicated past, the full account, the human version that didn't resolve cleanly into hero or failure. You had to trust them with it eventually. That was the work. Supper that evening was strange and not strange. Colt came in from the range to find a man he'd last seen across a courtroom table sitting on his porch drinking water and listening to his 6-year-old daughter explain the naming conventions she'd applied to the barn cats. He'd absorbed this with the self-contained adaptability he brought to most things, come inside to wash up, and come out to the table in the manner of a man who'd decided the situation was what it was, and meals still needed to be eaten. He and Silas shook hands. It was brief and not warm and not hostile. Two men who'd been adversaries by circumstance rather than choice, which was a specific kind of awkwardness that you had to get through rather than around. They managed. Supper was venison and late-season vegetables, and the cornbread that had become the house's constant, the one thing Marin made so regularly that Rue had once observed, with the precision of a man who'd eaten at many tables, that it was the best he'd had west of Missouri, which she'd received as the highest possible rating from that particular source. Silas ate and answered Della's questions. She had many, and spoke with Colt about the state of the road through the pass, and the water situation in the lower valley, and the general condition of the territory, the way men do when they've run out of pretense and defaulted to the practical. Marin sat and listened and ate and watched. At the end of the meal, when Della had gone to check on Bucket's evening whereabouts, and Rue had excused himself to his cabin and Colt had taken his coffee to the other end of the table to give them the courtesy of space, Silas looked at Marin and said quietly, "She's remarkable." "I know," Marin said. "She has Jonah's mouth, the way she moves it when she's thinking." Marin hadn't known that. She absorbed it. "She has her own way of thinking," she said. "Whatever she got from Jonah, she's made it hers." Yes. Silas wrapped his hands around his coffee. "I owe you a better apology than I put in the letter. The letter was true, but it was still paper." "You're here," she said. "That's not paper." "I was wrong," he said. "Not just strategically. I was wrong about you, and about what you needed, and about what was actually good for her." He paused. "I told myself I was acting for Della, but I think if I'm honest, and I'm trying to be honest, I was acting because I decided what the right outcome was, and I was going to produce it. That's different." She looked at him. This was the thing about men who were fundamentally decent but wrong. The wrongness didn't make them villains, which would have been easier. It just made them people who'd taken a particular kind of certainty too far, and had to live with the consequences of that, the way everyone lived with the consequences of their own specific blindness. "The land," she said. "The claim in Della's name. It's going to her on her 18th birthday, regardless of anything else. I want you to know that hasn't changed." "I know," he said. "It shouldn't have mattered the way it did." "It mattered," she said. "That's all right. Things matter to people. The question is what you do about it." He was quiet. Then, "How do I—" He stopped, started again. "I'd like to be someone in her life, her father's brother, some version of family she can come to if she wants it. I don't know how to ask for that without asking for too much." "You write," she said, "regularly. You send her things when it's her birthday. You don't appear without writing first." A pause. "And you let her decide the rest. She will, you know. She's already deciding. She spent this whole meal deciding whether you were worth the investment." Something in his face said he'd felt this and hadn't been sure whether to mention it. "And?" Marin considered. "She asked you whether he was funny," she said. "She didn't ask me that question. She's been thinking about it for months." She picked up her coffee. "She asked you." He seemed to understand what this meant. He left before dark to make it back to the lower valley by nightfall. Della stood on the porch and watched him go with her arms crossed and her expression of assessment still in operation. And then she said, as the sound of the horse faded down the road, "I think he's trying." "I think so too," Marin said. "It's not the same as being good at it." "No," Marin agreed, "but trying is where you start." Della uncrossed her arms. "I'm going to check on Agnes," she said, the same thing she always said when a conversation was resolved to her satisfaction, and went toward the barn. Colt came out and stood beside Marin on the porch. The evening was cold and clear, the stars just beginning to appear over the eastern ridge, the kind of October sky that you had to be at elevation to see properly, the deep, specific dark of it, the density of what was visible. "How'd that go?" he said. "Better than it could have." "That's all you're going to say?" She thought about Silas's face when she'd said, "She asked you." "He came," she said. "He didn't have to." Colt was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "He didn't." They stood together in the dark and cold of the October evening, and neither of them spoke for a while, which was something they'd gotten comfortable with. The particular quality of shared silence between two people who'd run out of the need to fill it. Winter came in again, the valley's second winter under Marin's tenure, and this time she knew it. She knew the way the cold moved through the north wall of the house if the fire dropped below a certain point, and she kept it above that point. She knew the chickens needed the extra grain earlier in the season than you'd think, and she gave it to them. She knew the root cellar's drainage issue would try to reassert itself in the first hard freeze, and she'd already improved the north wall channel in September, a full month before she needed to. She understood that winter, someone who had learned a place, not finished learning it. You never finish learning a place, which was one of the things that made a place worth staying in, but past the point of uncertainty into the territory of knowledge that felt like something you owned. Della turned 6 in November, in the first real snow of the season, and Vera Hargrove came up the valley road with a horse and weather that was arguably unreasonable for a social visit, and Colt made a cake that was dense and slightly lopsided and better than it looked. And Rue produced from some corner of his cabin a wooden horse he'd been carving for weeks without telling anyone, smooth-sided and sturdy, with a mane etched in careful lines. Della held it with both hands and looked at it with the full weight of her attention. "Did you make this?" she said. "Some time back," Rue said. "It looks like one of ours." "It's supposed to." She looked at it for another long moment. Then she looked at him with an expression that was trying to be composed and wasn't entirely succeeding. "Thank you, Rue," she said. He nodded once. Then he went and got his coffee and sat in his corner and pretended he hadn't noticed that anything significant had happened, which was the most Rue thing he could have done and which was, in its way, exactly right. That evening, after everyone had gone and Della was asleep with the wooden horse on the pillow beside her, Marin stood in the kitchen doing the last of the washing up, and Colt came in and leaned in the doorway and said, "She's happy." "Yes," Marin said. "I didn't know—" He stopped. "I didn't think I'd be good at this, whatever this is." She looked at him over her shoulder. Are you? He thought about it with the honesty he brought to everything. I think I'm getting there, he said. She turned back to the basin. That's where you start, she said, and he recognized the echo of what she'd said to Della on the porch about Silas. And he didn't say anything more, just pushed off the doorframe and came to stand beside her and picked up the drying cloth and started on the dishes she'd washed. They worked through them together, as they'd done 100 times, with the comfortable efficiency of two people who'd figured out each other's rhythms, and the stove was going, and the snow was coming down outside the window, and the house was warm. The thing that nobody tells you about building something from nothing is how quiet it is when you get there. Marin had expected, after all of it, the 39 cents, the courtroom, the winter posts, the root cellar, and the garden, and the months of work that had pulled the ranch from neglect into something living. She'd expected some kind of announcement, some moment where it would be clear that the hard part was over and this was the rest. It didn't work like that. The morning after the February ruling had felt exactly like any other morning, because there was still breakfast to make and the stove needed wood, and Della had woken up with a question about subtraction that couldn't wait. Life doesn't pause to let you appreciate the turning points. It moves and you move with it, and the turning points become apparent in retrospect, like the way you can see where a river bends from a height you couldn't have reached without first walking through the valley. She understood this now. In the winter of her second year, standing at the kitchen window with coffee going cold in her hand and the snow coming down on the garden she'd put to bed in October with the careful attention of someone who'd be back in March to wake it up again. She understood that she had not arrived anywhere. That was the thing. She had not won and been done with winning. She had simply gotten to a place where the work had changed its quality, from desperate to purposeful, from survival to building, from holding on to choosing. That was not a small distinction. It was, in fact, everything. She thought about the woman who'd walked into Alderton's general store with 39 cents and walked out with nothing. She thought about that woman with a kind of tenderness that surprised her. Not pity, which would have been the wrong register, but the specific empathy you could only extend to your own past self once you were far enough from it to see it clearly. That woman had been doing what you do when you have nothing. She'd kept moving. She'd counted what she had, and she'd gone looking for more, and when she'd found the door, she'd walked through it with her eyes open. That was not luck. Or not only luck. Colt Mercer, with his dollar on the postbox, was luck, or kindness, or some specific human impulse toward another person that defied clean categorization. But what Marin had done with that dollar, and the job, and the valley, and the months of cold work, that was not luck. That was her. She'd needed someone to put the dollar on the box. Everyone needed someone at some point to put the dollar on the box. That was not weakness. That was what it was to be human in a world where you couldn't always see the next thing, and the people around you sometimes made the difference between making it and not. What mattered was what you did once the dollar was there. She had learned this the way you learn most true things, not from being told it, but from living through the version of events that demonstrated it. You could spend your whole life waiting to deserve help, making yourself small enough to not need it, and the smallness would consume you. Or you could receive what came your way with clear eyes and do the work and become the kind of person who could, eventually, put the dollar on the box for someone else. She intended to be that person. She was, she thought, beginning to be that. Set. In late February, a woman appeared at the Valley Road. She came on foot, which was unusual, with a child on her hip and a bag that looked heavier than she could comfortably carry, and the specific expression of someone who'd been walking longer than they'd planned on and wasn't sure they'd reached the right place. Marin saw her from the porch and went down. The woman was young, younger than Marin had been when she'd arrived in Black Ridge, and she had the look of someone trying to hold her face together in front of a stranger. The child on her hip was a boy, maybe 2, with his face pressed into his mother's shoulder. I heard there was a ranch up here, the woman said. I heard they might need help. Marin looked at her. The coat was wrong for the weather. The bag was a flour sack tied at the top. The child's boots were sound, which told you something about what this woman's priorities were. Who told you that? Marin said. A man named Caswell, down in the valley. He said... She stopped. He said the woman up here would understand the situation. Marin stood in the cold February morning and looked at this young woman holding her child and her flour sack bag and her careful composure, and she thought, Yes, Caswell was right. Come inside, she said. It's cold. We'll talk over coffee. The woman's composure shifted slightly, just at the edges, the way composure does when someone says something that matters and you weren't sure they would. Thank you, she said. I'm Marin, she said, turning toward the house. Edith, the woman said, and followed her up the steps. Inside, the stove was going. The coffee was on. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and the bread Marin had set to rise that morning. Della was at the table with her slate, and she looked up when they came in and assessed the situation with her customary frankness and apparently found it acceptable, because she slid over on the bench to make room. You can sit here, she told the boy, who had lifted his face from his mother's shoulder to look around at the kitchen with wide, uncertain eyes. He looked at Della. Della looked at him. Some agreement was reached that neither of them verbalized. Marin poured the coffee and set it in front of Edith and sat down across from her and said, Tell me about your situation. Edith told her. It was not the same as Marin's situation. It had its own specific shape, its own particular series of doors that had closed, and one that had opened just enough to push through. But it had the quality that all such situations had in common, which was a woman doing the arithmetic of what she had versus what she needed, and finding the gap and looking for a way across it. Marin listened until she understood it. Then she said, The ranch can use help in the kitchen garden starting in March. There's a room off the back that's been empty since last fall. It's small, but it's warm. She looked at the boy, who had accepted a piece of bread from Della and was eating it with the focused attention of someone who'd been hungry. Your boy looks healthy. He is, Edith said with the pride of someone who'd worked to make that true. Good, Marin said. Keep him that way and we'll have no problems. Edith looked at her across the table. Why are you doing this? Marin picked up her coffee. She thought about what to say and decided on the true thing, which was also the simple thing. Someone did it for me, she said. Not in the same way. Nothing's ever exactly the same. But someone made room when I didn't have any. That's all I'm doing. Edith was quiet. Then, is there anything you need to know? About me? Before you decide? I'll learn what I need to know, Marin said. The deciding's already done. Spring came back. It came back because it always did, which was one of the things you could count on. Not comfort, not ease, but the turn of the season, the return of light, the creek running high with snowmelt, and the first green at the edges of the garden beds Marin had put to sleep in October. She was out there on a morning in late March, on her knees in the dirt doing the first assessment of what had survived the winter, when she heard boots on the path and looked up. Colt was coming from the barn, and beside him was Della, who had apparently attached herself to the morning feed without anyone asking her to, as she sometimes did when she woke early and found the day already doing things without her. They stopped at the garden edge. How's it looking? Colt asked. The garlic's already up, she said. Just barely, but it's there. Della crouched down at the row's edge and looked. I see it, she said. It's tiny. It'll get bigger. I know, Della said. She said it with the confidence of a child who had now watched a garden grow and understood the process, who no longer needed to be told that small things became larger ones if you let them. She straightened up and looked at the valley, at the brown gold of the pastures starting to give way to the first suggestion of green, at the creek, at the peak still white above the timberline. She'd grown 2 inches since October. Marin measured her against the kitchen doorframe and it was clear. Papa, Della said, not looking at Colt, just looking at the valley, as if the word were simply part of the landscape she was describing. Can we go up to the North Ridge this weekend? Rue said there are still elk up there. There was a brief pause. The space of time it took a man to understand that a word he hadn't been awarded had just been handed to him, without ceremony, without announcement, in the way that real things arrived. Not with a speech, not at the moment you'd been waiting for, just in the middle of a morning, by a garden, looking at the mountains. Marin did not look at Colt. She kept her eyes on the garlic row, on the thin green tips pushing up from the dark soil. Sure, Colt said, and his voice was steady and he meant it, and there was nothing else in the word except the answer, which was exactly right. Della nodded, satisfied, and went to find out what Edith's boy was doing by the barn. Marin sat back on her heels and looked at the garden. The garlic was small and green and entirely sure of itself, pushing up through ground that had been frozen solid 3 weeks ago. It didn't know how cold it had been. It only knew what it was supposed to do, and it was doing it. She'd planted those bulbs in October with cold, stiff hands, tamping the soil over each one, thinking about next spring's table and the person she'd be when she got there. She was that person now. She was here. She had the child and the man and the old man with the bad knee and the woman in the back room who was learning to trust slowly, which was the right speed, and the neighbor with the opinions and the letters from a brother-in-law trying his imperfect way toward something better, and the ledger on the shelf with the notes about what had worked and what she'd do differently this year, written for the person she'd be next year. This was not the life she'd planned. She had planned nothing like this. She had planned Jonah and the house in Black Ridge, and something that looked more like continuity than adventure. But plans were made by the people you used to be, and you became someone else in the living of them. And what you ended up with was not what you'd planned, but what you'd built. And the difference between those two things was the whole of it. The whole measure of what a life could be if you were willing to do the work and walk through the door when it opened and set the table for whoever came in from the cold. She pressed her hand flat against the garden soil, cold still, deep down, but working, already working. Colt's hand found her shoulder, brief, warm, the ordinary touch of someone who'd gotten used to you and meant it. She leaned into it slightly, just slightly, the way you lean into things that have turned out to be solid. The morning was clear and cold and entirely itself, and there was work to do, and she was ready for it, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.